Hello, everybody. My name is Ian Kirkpattacake. I'm an author and a robot, and today, well, it's the first video of the month, and normally this is reserved for Lamoy, but I had a couple of problems. Number one was that I didn't get the Lamoy listing up until like maybe at least a third of the way through the month, so it went up super late. And then number two, I pretty much just said send me whatever you're proud of, and apparently nobody is proud right now. So I get it. That's been my entire month of October for the most part, except for yesterday, where I received a very good review on my newly released Bleed More Body More, available everywhere right now. And so I was feeling good yesterday, but I get the writer whiplash, and I get the not feeling it. So apparently no Lamoy this month. I also might have hexed it by calling out our 1-year anniversary and then being like, huzzah. So let's hope for let's hope I didn't scare everybody. And there's an actual prompt now with a back to the normal word limit. So hopefully in December we'll have some new entries to check out. So look at that down in the description below if you would like to connect with Lamoy on this channel, because I certainly would. The other thing is also make sure to check out Pitch Fit down below if you are a creative and would like your creative work featured on this channel. At the end of December, I'll be doing the last Pitch Fit of this year, which is where I talk about your guys' stories. Just share to hope that authors and readers find each other, because really getting your work in front of other people is like the hardest thing after the first draft. Drafting sucks, people. I hate it. I hate it so much. So instead of doing Lamoy, let's talk about Titanshade. Now, from the title of this video, you know that something went down. I'm going to start out by saying I had no idea who Dan Stout is. I still don't know who Dan Stout is, to be honest with you. And I found this book via Minds because the cover was posted. I think the cover had just been like redone. And so I think the cover artist was showing off the cover, and I love this cover. There is so much attitude in this cover. I'm staring at it right now. But there's so much personality in this cover, and I was so about this. But I ended up not finishing this book. I got about halfway, and then I just kind of fell off of reading for a couple of months, because this was sitting in my I need to finish reading this area. And I kind of read other stuff, but I didn't move this one. And I was still reading slower because I was like, I have to go back to Titanshade and finish reading it. Just didn't want to. So after a couple of months, I kind of quit. And I'm sorry to Ryan for bailing on this. I got to about 50% before I was just like, I am having a really hard time with this. And I will tell you why I had a really hard time with it eventually. I still love this cover, and I feel like I would give Titanshade another chance if it was made into a television show or a movie, just because I like the vibe here, and it might really do much better as a visual media as opposed to a book because of the way that it's written. So the other thing on this cover is that it does a really, really great job of conveying the genre that is in this, which is a mixture of noir and fantasy. Like, there's no way that you could mistake this. It's buddy cops with fantasy intertwined. And, like, I don't have anything against fantasy. I apparently read a ton of fantasy, even though I don't. One of my hottest book reading takes is that I don't really like fantasy. Everybody that I know likes fantasy, and I am just not that into it, and for some reason I keep picking up fantasies. The book I'm reading right now, which hopefully I'm aiming to talk about it next week, is also a fantasy, and I'm just like, why do I keep doing this to myself? We'll get into it. Look, like I said, I don't absolutely hate fantasy. I particularly do like urban fantasies and magical realism, stuff that has some grounding in reality and doesn't just go totally far out there, which is one of the reasons why I thought I would have liked this, because it's a buddy cop. It's got like the city dwelling thing going on. It's not totally out there, but then it does have aliens, which kind of goes a little further than I like to go with my fantastical elements. But I digress. I'm just... For at risk of making the entire reading and writing community angry. I'm just not that into fantasy, and it's apparently what everybody is writing. So, nothing on you guys. I just am not that into it. Sorry. But having said all of that, let's go ahead and get into a basic premise. And I'm trying to condense my premising of books. I don't know. I don't think I did a very good job at it this time, but it is a shorter premise in introduction, I think. As always, this is just my opinion, and I highly recommend, if the cover interests you, if the ideas in here interest you, or if you would like a fuller picture of what it is I'm talking about, I recommend that you pick up this book, because I am not a fan. It doesn't mean that you won't be. I mean, look at these guys. Look at this smug face right here. You just make one. Boop, 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 boop. That's just a little. Anyway, I can't. My hands that way. Let's go ahead and get started. So the main character's name is Carter. He's a veteran on the force, a detective with an angsty past and skills to keep him on the job, even if he's just a little bit uncouth. He's actually a lot more than a little bit uncouth, but we'll get to that. And of course, with describing Carter in that way, we open with him sitting at a bar, waiting for his shift to end so that he can have his first drink of the evening. As you do, Joey pretty much nails all detectives with her description of detectives. If you want to know what that reference is, Bleed More, Body More, available now. But so he's waiting for his shift to end so he can drink. But his shift can't end soon enough. Before the clock hits, it's time to go. He gets an emergency call. Code 21, all available units. So he rushes to a hotel where cops are already laid out, and the dead body of a squib has been found in a room. The thing smells like gore and apple pie. The death pheromones that come off of the squib bodies when they're dead cause weird reactions in humans, which forces Carter to leave to get a mask. Now, this dead squib wasn't a nobody. It's not some random hit or an overdose in a room. He was some kind of high-rolling ambassador with political connections. Carter's got a record for being not exactly a by-the-book cop and having some PR issues because of a previous situation he was in, so he's not entirely welcomed into this case. But that doesn't really matter, because who plays by the rules when you're Carter anyway? Yeah, you just don't. So he's gonna do what he's gonna do. Upon even a brief further investigation into the dead squib, it looks like big money and big politics are very much involved. Carter leaves the scene to go to his normal dive bar, thinking one of his connections might have some answers on the dead guy. It turns out that the murdered was some kind of government agent making negotiations for a wind farm project. The murder of the squib is going to derail talks of alternate energy that's not oil, which would put the city of Titanshade back at risk of going bankrupt. Due to the political nature of this case, the police chief decides that everyone is going to be working as a buddy system. Due to the political nature of this case, the police chief decides that everybody is going to work with a buddy, and this is when we're introduced to Carter's new buddy cop, Ajax. That would be the squiddly alien-looking guy right here on the cover. He is what is called a Malin Campy. He's a new cop, kind of fresh out of police school, and someone who does things by the book. Now, one of the main things to know about Malin Campy, because this really comes out and was one of the problems that I had with this book, is that Ajax, being the new guy, and this might be a genre trope, but since I don't read a ton of noir, I'm not sure if this is typically how it's used, but Ajax, being the new cop, is pretty much used as a soundboard for Carter to just tell everything to, because Ajax is the new guy and Carter is the veteran detective. And so when Ajax doesn't know anything, or when they walk into a crime scene, it's Carter's chance to just go bleh with a bunch of exposition or a bunch of observations that weren't actually made on the page, so that Carter can show how much of a veteran he is, and this guy can just listen. So this guy almost even feels like a stand-in for the reader, so that Carter can directly talk to the reader and directly tell the reader things, when otherwise it would seem unnatural. Kind of like a confidant style person. Anyway, continuing, we move into another dive bar. to just catch up with more connections, ask questions, and leave. The majority of the plot that I got through for this book is driven by Carter deciding who he wants to talk to, sometimes unprompted, driving there and then asking questions via an interview or an interrogation, and getting information that way. Very little prompts the discussions with many of the characters introduced. It was more like Carter had just worked the job for so long that he knew how things went, he knew who to talk to, and so then he went to those places, talked to those people, pulled information, suddenly got the right questions in his head that had absolutely nothing to do with what was being discussed, and then followed that lead. He automatically knew who to ask for information and what information to ask. Plus, every time he was like, hey Jax, we're gonna go somewhere to ask some questions, it felt like it was out of nowhere. The reader couldn't even guess where this was gonna go because it just sort of happened as it happened, and there weren't really chances for observation. So then Ajax and Carter learn about some local gang involvement, and then they go and talk to a prostitute connection Carter has. One of the main people he knows in the prostitution arena is Talena. She's like a daughter to him, but not a prostitute, as she tries to evangelize to the prostitutes and save them from bad people. In this book, the prostitutes are called candies. So anytime I say candies in the review, I'm referring to prostitutes. So then Carter talks to the candies because it seems like there was a candy visiting the dead guy at or around the time of his murder, and Carter wants some names. Because Ajax is the much more reasonable one, whenever they need to be more reasonable, he does the talking, while whenever they need a little more muscle or a little more roughness, Carter does that talking. After hearing about Ajax's background, Carter determines that Ajax is way too naive and has way too much faith, and this city will beat him or rob him of that in no time, because he is a jaded cop and he's been through it all. While back at the precinct, talking over the information that they've discovered and where the leads go, the boys get a new emergency call, a fresh homicide. Lunchtime is over. The two of them arrive at a house in a quiet neighborhood. Inside, one of the few remaining family members is being interviewed. Here, Carter shows his skills of how he kind of just knows everything without even looking by telling the reader what has happened here without really describing any of the scenery or what sort of clues he's noticing. He just goes, hey, Ajax, so that chick's got blood on her shoes, and so she is obviously the one that found the body. Like, he doesn't sort of assess the room. He just kind of tells, again, he just kind of uses Ajax as a way to tell the reader things and be the guy that knows everything. The two of them split up, investigate the house. 2 dead children, the parents are dead, the third sibling is missing and suspect. Now Carter and Ajax get a call to head over to the government plaza for an important meeting right freaking now. You need to go right freaking now. At the plaza, Carter and Ajax talk to Jellica, a diplomatic envoy who desperately wants the murder of the squib to be solved. She's asked if she might know somebody that would have wanted to hurt that squib, and she can't think of anybody. It's up to Carter and Ajax to say, what about the guy that runs the oil farm in town? Isn't the whole wind business kind of counterintuitive to the oil, like they're warring against each other? And she goes, oh yeah, you're right. That guy is a like a big pain in our side, because he's putting up billboards saying how wind energy is not going to work and whatnot. He's kind of an asshole and a rival and a big mouth, and if he succeeds, our business fails. So yeah, I guess that guy would not have good feelings for our dead squib. Carter and Ajax return to a bar to talk to one of the leads that Carter has. And then they go on about magic and mana. So that's a whole nother element that's introduced into the story, as being a very rare element. And I can't remember a whole lot of it because I read this a while ago. I almost wasn't even going to do a review on it, but I was like, let's talk about it, I guess. So now we've got magic and mana in this universe with this squiddly guy and this air farm, After they're done at the bar talking about mana and magic, Ajax pulls out a city map and they comment on the size of the city and how everyone is pretty much on top of each other because it is so crammed and everything, and then the scene ends. I'm just mentioning this because the shift here was kind of abrupt for me. Carter returns to the woman from the family murder scene that was just a little bit ago. Apparently she's the aunt of the missing child. She's also a drug user, and that's mostly what this scene is about, because Carter kind of calls her out on being a drug user, and she talks about how you never actually quit using drugs. It's just part of the program that you acknowledge that you do drugs, and you never actually stop being a drug user even when you're not using drugs. That's pretty much the only thing that comes out of that conversation. Carter returns to the police station. Reporters are everywhere. A Candy has died. One of the reporters is trying to interview Carter and getting in his face and flashing his camera, but Carter is startled and hits the reporter with his car. Now, inside the precinct, they've got a girl for an interview. During the whole scene, there's some blood magic and sorcery going on, so add that to the list of things involved in the story. Some level of torture of the apprentice is here to get the blood necessary to do the sorcery, and everyone watching from the other side of the glass is like, what the fuck? And they are horrified because the apprentice is pretty much being abused by magic in order to make this seance work. So the sorcery uses mouth and a ribbon like a typewriter to share a message because that's what's actually happening. Oh. So what the sorcerer's doing is using basically like the blood and body of this girl and a ribbon in her mouth as a typewriter. So her mouth is like, she's channeling a ghost. I think it's the ghost of the squib. And the ghost of the squib is like coming through her and somehow putting words onto this ribbon like it's a typewriter, and then that comes out of her mouth, and then they've got the message because this whole thing is a seance. After the seance, Carter learns the details of the murdered Candy and discovers that it's the same person that he'd been looking into about the Squib's Candy girl when he had been talking to his Candy contact. He also, okay. So this is where Carter kind of takes a turn, as if he hasn't taken one already, into focusing on his old partner, Flanagan. Freaking Flanagan. And everything about the story starts relating to Flanagan. Up to this point, Flanagan is not really mentioned, and he comes out of nowhere because Carter's got a chip on his shoulder about Flanagan. And clearly, because Flanagan did wrong before and messed up as his partner, everything is gonna go back to Flanagan because Carter is an angry mofo. I mean, look at this guy's face. He is somebody that cannot let it go. Unrelated, you don't even want to see my notes on this because I have that name spelled different every single time I write it. I swear, I could not remember how exactly it was spelled in this book. I could not remember how exactly it was spelled in this book. Anyway, now Carter is obsessed with finding Flanagan because he has to be involved in this, and everyone else is calling Carter crazy and obsessed. Everyone is calling Carter on this, and even Ajax is like, bruh, your reputation is as a drunk asshole. No one is going to follow your lead on your ex-partner that you have an obsessive grudge against and absolutely no evidence that he did anything. Though ultimately, they recover because someone else insults Carter and how insane he is, and Ajax is like, hey, I'm the only one that's allowed to mock him, not you, and then they have a bonding partner moment, because that's what you do. Side note, I feel like I'm dropping so much information in order to condense this plot, but I'm trying to be more concise with these reviews so they don't go on for like an hour and a half to 2 hours. I think it's going to take me some time to get used to condensing to the most, like, the major things without getting into the nitty-gritty details, so please bear with me on that while I try to figure out how I want to do this better. Anyway, for the rest of the half that I read, Carter chases more political leads. Jellica points to people that she thinks are guilty, which end up making her look guilty, in my opinion, because it's like, well, you're just pointing at all these people that you would like to get arrested, right? And then Carter chases his Flanagan lead down to some cult he's joined since he's quit the Force, or was forced to quit the Force. And we learn some of the angst in Carter's background has to do with Flanagan being a dirty cop that had once been Carter's partner, and Carter ended up killing an innocent child, and Carter's dragging himself over the coals for having done that. Carter then gets enough evidence to get a squad of people together to go to Flanagan's farmhouse in the middle of nowhere and break down the door. Now, the whole plan was, because Carter is involved, they're supposed to keep it as low profile as possible to not get attention from the media, because Carter's got bad PR already, and he's really not supposed to be doing a bunch of stuff, especially not stuff that gets him reporter attention. Apparently that doesn't stick because they break down the door, go in guns blazing, and they chase down Flanagan's wife and 14-year-old child with guns when Flanagan isn't really even fleeing or resisting. But they just, like, immediately charge on this house, don't give him a chance to just give up. They break the door down, run through the house, guns a-blazing. Yeah. That's all I can say, okay? It's a hot mess. It was one of the most reckless arrests in a book I have ever seen. We need to minimize coverage. I know, I've got an idea. Let's just break down the door and fight people off with our guns. Okay, almost shoot a child. Okay. During the investigation, Carter gets pissed off because Flanagan has found religion and moved on from his traumatic past, and Carter is like, fuck you, I'm still stuck on this. You're not allowed to move on while I'm still stuck. What is wrong with you? He actually wants to punch Flanagan over that. So now he's thinking about the case that got him in trouble. He killed an infant while saving Flanagan's life. Then it turned out that Flanagan was a monster and the most corrupt cop ever. The problem is they couldn't convict Flanagan of anything because there were no witnesses who would testify, so they let him off. Because apparently physical evidence also doesn't count for anything. Meanwhile, Carter was taken out of public view, though he still works for the cops. I'm sorry, one of my problems here was that Carter was acting like he had the moral high ground over Flanagan, while he was also a corrupt cop the entire time that we've been reading this book, which made this much harder for me to enjoy. After talking to Flanagan, they're now going to press charges. We've got no evidence. Apparently Flanagan knowing the squib and having been at a party where a lot of other people were at is enough to press charges. And yeah, this won't end poorly, right? It makes more sense to push this because the DA wants to close the case and is breathing down their necks, but that also just implicates this entire police department as bad. Which maybe they are, because this is a poor town, probably a corrupt system, so you've got that, but they're willing to forego evidence in an investigation to catch a guy that they have a grudge against, even if it's a wrongful conviction, they just want to punish him. They're doing this because he's a piece of shit going where he belongs, so really the actual guilt doesn't matter. And for me, this made it really, really hard for me to actually want to stick with this book or like these characters, because it's just about a corrupt police department at this point. I don't care that this guy doesn't like Flanagan or that Flanagan did him wrong at some point. You're justifying doing really terrible things to somebody in the entire police system. And I also get that this is part of a series, so maybe that is done on purpose. But I just couldn't care enough because this character was corrupt, and apparently all the other cops were corrupt because they were just going along with this, and I'm not into that kind of story. I like my corrupted, terrible people stories and like watching somebody fall and fail, but I just could not get into watching an entire corrupt police system just be like, yeah, we're just going to pin this guy because we don't like him, we don't need evidence, we're just going to push this, and I might be a bad cop, but I'm the good kind of bad cop. While you're, I'll get into that when I'm talking about my like things about this. So I should add that they're talking about pressing charges before the station has even started looking for evidence at the farm. This totally doesn't sound like a situation where planted evidence by corrupted cops would run rampant. I mean, good gosh, worse. Okay, so Carter blatantly says, we can hold the murder charges until we actually question him and discover inconsistencies. You know, says break apart his stories and search the farm. They literally have nothing on him, but they're charging him with murder. Literally nothing. Carter says that he's uncomfortable with how Flanagan was on the farm and didn't even put up a fight. One of his coworkers is like, oh my gosh, you're not backing down from this, are you? You're the one that was pushing us to go and arrest him, and are you really gonna be the one that backs down? So while Flanagan is in custody, he's obviously this member of this religion and or cult that is now coming out to defend him on television and talking to reporters, saying that Flanagan is totally innocent and the cops are out of whack. So despite the obvious tensions between Carter and Flanagan, his police department lets him go and talk to Flanagan all by himself. And this is where Carter picks a fight with Flanagan, saying, you're so corrupt and so screwed. How much did you pay your cult friends to speak on your behalf? Gag. And he is thinking how much he wants to beat the hell out of Flanagan. Excuse me, Carter, you are so out of control. Maybe that's the point, but your claims of corrupt cop just look like projection at this point. A high-powered lawyer shows up at the precinct to be Flanagan's lawyer, and everybody is like, something sketchy is going on, because how is Flanagan connected to this high-powered political lawyer, and why is this high-powered political lawyer doing it for free? Carter leaves. He then goes and talks to Jellica, who was that diplomatic envoy from forever ago, again, and they exchange both some personal information, backstories on themselves, and then Jellica gives more information to Carter for people that she thinks he should look at. Then Carter gets information about the missing son from that family murder scene, and he and Ajax go to a butcher shop somewhere where there is a shootout between the worker there, the runaway son, and the two cops. The runaway son is fatally wounded and dies. Ajax is shot, and Carter arrests an old woman on the scene who had been the one to shoot Ajax because it is a crime to shoot at a cop. She shot a cop, and there's nothing that he could do. And so this is pretty much where my book notes end because I just couldn't do this book anymore. Like I said, it was a mixture of the character, the main central character, the focus on it being a corrupt police department in a corrupt city, which I get is a thing, I'm just not into it. And then the writing style that I just couldn't get into. So let's talk about my response to this book in general. The two biggest reasons that I couldn't keep going with this book were Carter's character and the storytelling style, which those are kind of the biggest constants in any book, the main character and the writing style. So if they're not clicking with you, you're just not going to get the book. For Carter, I just couldn't stand him. Okay, so the two major things for Carter were that he is a corrupt cop and he pretends that he is not. He pretends that he is better than every other corrupt cop on the force. And as far as 50% goes, one of his main nemesis is a corrupt cop, and he pretends that he is better than him the whole time. Now, I might have been more sensitive to this specific issue because when I had read this, I was just coming off of a class about police tactics and interviewing and just how easy it is to manipulate and how many to manipulate eyewitnesses and suspects and what interrogation tactics can be like. And pretty much Carter was doing everything that a bad cop would do. Now, is it only bad cops that use bad interrogation tactics? No, it's a lot of untrained cops that also use bad interrogation tactics. But considering how Carter is a veteran in the system, it's more likely that he is corrupt using bad methodologies in order to get results as opposed to truthfully pursuing suspects and crime and trying to solve things and make the city a better place. He's just as corrupt as everybody else in this town. And you know, that would be one thing as well. And I can understand a corrupt cop who is also justifying to himself his own corruption and saying, well, I'm the good kind of corruption, so I'm allowed to do this because I'm doing it for a better cause. But also there was no foil to this character because I think Ajax was supposed to be a foil to this because obviously you've got the veteran jaded cop and then the newbie cop over here with a bunch of faith to him. But one, Ajax was constantly absent because they were separating to go and do their different things. Carter with his interrogations all by himself or interviews all by himself, and Ajax just doing something else because he either was busy or he was angry at Carter, so he just decided to walk off. The other thing was that Ajax didn't really have that strong of a personality because, like I said during the plot summary, he felt more like a stand-in for the reader so that Carter could just tell things straight to the reader. So there wasn't a huge personality there that was able to balance out Carter's cynicism and jadedness and corruption and say, you know, there is this push and pull, this yin and yang. It was just the listener, the reader, and Carter, the corrupt. So there was really nowhere to go with that. When it comes to the storytelling style, now this might be a noir thing, I don't know, because I don't read enough specifically noir things to say if this is for sure how noirs typically go, or if this was just how this noir is. Maybe it's a bit of both, but everything that moved the story forward in this felt like it came from an interview or an interrogation. So it was constantly just the character sits down with somebody, asks them a bunch of questions. The character then answers via exposition, and or the interviewer comes up with where this is going to go, tells the reader what's happening, and then they move on to the next scene. And it was just exposition after exposition after exposition. And even when they went into a crime scene, like the one in the house, you didn't get to kind of walk around the crime scene and be introduced to what he was seeing and then see him connect things together that would allow you to also connect things together. It was just, she's got blood on her. Oh, you see that? You see that, Ajax, over there? That chick's got blood on the bottom of her shoe. That means that she is the one that found the body. Like, he didn't walk into the house, notice all these things, and then explain what he was seeing. He saw them and explained them at the same time. This made it harder to enjoy because it just seemed like Carter was superpowered, knew everything, and was forcing the story along to go where it needed to go because he already freaking knew everything. Now, one of my favorite all-time television shows is Psych, and Sean Spencer, is super good at being very observant, and his whole thing is being so observant that he looks psychic and pretends to be psychic. That would have worked really, really well here for Carter if Carter walked in and noticed all these things, told the reader all of these things, and then shared them with the newbie here. Because then it would have separated the creating the setting, the finding the clues, and then explaining the clues, which would give the readers a chance to also see it with Carter. But instead, you just have Carter knowing everything and telling the reader everything. And this includes the same thing with the interviews, is Carter would tell you information of where the story was going or who was responsible without any evidence whatsoever. And maybe this was resolved later on. I can't tell you since I didn't finish reading it, but it's the same way that we have ended up with, oh, Flanagan is guilty. It's just like suddenly Carter is blaming Flanagan for what is happening, and then later on we find the evidence because turns out Flanagan was there. But there were no hints whatsoever of Flanagan's involvement. It's just Carter aggressively said, this guy done it. Here's a whole explanation, including my grudge against him, and now we are going to call him guilty and pursue evidence later. So when most of the story is told in that way, and then you just don't like the main character, just not my kind of main character. And again, I like my morally not great characters, even my evil characters. Obviously, American Psycho is one of my favorite stories. Obviously, I'm writing a story inspired by Jeffrey Dahmer, and he is the main character, and you get to see his fall into, horror and crime and evil. But there's such a difference between that and then like a corrupt cop who thinks he's better than all of the other corrupt cops, and the whole system is corrupt, and you don't have a foil for that. And I'm wondering if at any point, and I would be very interested in hearing from anybody that's read this book and then read this series, if it gets better, if it's recognized that what Carter is doing is corruption and he becomes a better cop, or is the way that he operates seen as a good way of doing things. Because I can't get on board with bad and manipulative interrogation tactics like this, like so blatantly this. Getting away from that, some of the other things that I did notice about this was, number one, the mood was set really hard and very fast, immediate noir feeling, and I really liked the narrator's voice from the start, with him sitting in the bar waiting to get off the clock so that he can have his first drink. The premise is super interesting for alien creatures, the viscera, smell, and taste, and the way the detective was both disgusted and hungered at seeing the bloody corpse. I really liked the world building and the interesting concepts and juxtapositions created for the characters in this universe. I really liked it, which I think one of the reasons why I would give this a chance if it was a visual media like a movie or a TV series is because those interrogation scenes could be much more interesting if they were visualized as opposed to just sitting down and talking on a piece of paper, because then you could see the body language and the characters interact. But I'm not sure that this really kept my attention as a way of moving the story forward in a literary format, if that makes sense. There was a little bit of inconsistency for me where I didn't see the shifting motivations in the character of Carter, where he said he didn't want to work on the case. That was at the very beginning of the book, where all available units were called in, and then he was told, oh yeah, I don't want you on this case. And then he was like, well, I'm gonna be on this case. Okay, I get it if you are a rebel and that's kind of your jam, but also I didn't see the switch, and he continually said how much he didn't want to be working on a case while also going behind his boss's back to work on a case. So that stood out to me. I have in my notes here by chapter 5, I had been hoping to see more buddy cop bonding because Ajax was just sort of trailing along behind Carter to see the scenes without really doing much. Chapter 6, it says they're just making guesses to move the plot forward just by talking back and forth rather than actually investigating anything. That took place at, the crime scenes, at the bars, at just about everything. They just sat down and kind of spitballed back and forth, and that became the next area in which they were moving, and that felt more like a thinking device to move a plot forward instead of characters actually doing something to move the plot forward, if that makes any sense. That included speculating on like what the race of the killer was without any evidence or any reason to guess what race the killer would be. They just decided, well, probably maybe this thing, I guess, while they're talking to one another, and then they would pursue that. And that is such a dangerous thing. So again, when I was reading this book, I was taking an interrogation methods, eyewitness statements and interrogation, something like that. It very specifically focused on interrogation and eyewitness statement and I had to do a presentation on false convictions due to confession. And one of the things that we talked about early on, and I bring it up all the time, and I remember it all the time when I'm writing crime stuff or detective stuff, I keep this in mind with Detective Stone, is that the first major mistake that any detective can do, which will lead to a false conviction, is the misclassification error. Now, the misclassification error is the decision that this is who or what the criminal looks like, and you get tunnel vision and focus because you've already determined that is who is guilty. And then you don't look in any other direction. You kind of disregard all other information, and that is more likely to lead you to a false conviction because you have already determined who is guilty. You're only going to look at information that is that. And if you come across information that directly contradicts what you've said, you're not going to agree with it. There are even cases in which cops, detectives have gotten into this misclassification error, and I can't say whether it is they had that tunnel vision or they were just completely corrupt. Sometimes it's very difficult to tell, and they will force their suspects to eventually write a confession statement or sign a confession statement with all of this inaccurate information, and then they'll go to court and all of the physical evidence is contrary to what is in the confession statement. And so instead of revisiting on whether or not the suspect is actually guilty, they'll just have the police precinct will just write a new confession statement and have the same suspect sign the new confession statement when stuff is all completely wrong. And that when stuff is all completely, the spoken word is completely different from what the physical evidence shows, you'd think that'd be time to kind of start looking at maybe we've gotten this wrong. But in a lot of cases, once they've hit the misclassification error, they don't back down. And that's how false confessions and false imprisonments get made in one of the major steps. Another one becomes once you get the misclassification error, you get the contamination error, which is that if you've already assumed that somebody is guilty, then when you're talking to them, you're likely to share information that only the killer would have, thus contaminating them and their memories and their information, so they'll know things that they shouldn't know or didn't know, but you told them because you assumed that they were guilty, so now they have that information. The other error that is often made with those other two is a coercion error, which is once you've got your misclassification and you've focused on that person and determined they are it and you've contaminated them, then because you've determined that they are guilty, then you're okay with using whatever sort of coercion methods you have at your legal and sometimes secretive polls. You're okay with coercing a confession out of that person because you've already determined that they're guilty. You just got to get them to say it so you can present it to the judge and say, look, they admitted it, even if none of your evidence matches. This is one of the worst things that you can do as a detective preparing a case because you don't need physical evidence in a lot of cases if you have a confession statement. Even in the cases where there is absolutely no evidence, and that was one of the cases that I talked about in my presentation I did for class, is that these 4 guys were sentenced to something where there was no evidence whatsoever that they did anything. And even the judge was like, yeah, if not for your confession statement, we couldn't charge you with anything. And they wouldn't take it back, even when the guy who initially pointed the finger at these 4 guys and said they did it, now let my friend go, he was no longer charged for his crimes because he was seen as coerced to give his statement. However, those other 4 guys that he pointed out were not released. I don't even know if I'm making enough sense. I feel like I'm skipping because my brain is all over the place with this. But spoiler alert, those 4 guys that he implicated, they were all innocent. There was no evidence against them. They were completely uninvolved. They didn't even know the victim. But because they had been coerced into giving a confession, the judge took the confession as all of the evidence they needed to imprison these guys for 15 to 20 years. So, getting back to this, watching these guys, specifically Carter, who's this veteran over here, who's supposed to know better, just sitting down at a bar and then speculating who this person, who the killer is, without any evidence whatsoever, just talking to Ajax through who he thinks it is and then pursuing, especially when you go into pursuing Flanagan, misclassification, the pursuit of this thing. And then if it did turn out to be Flanagan, I obviously didn't finish it to see if it was Flanagan. If it did turn out to be Flanagan, then this just is sets a terrible precedent of this guy was guilty. I determined it was guilty without evidence, and then I just pursued until I found the evidence that I needed. And I just, my gosh, it was so obnoxious, and I just can't do it. I can't do it. Pet peeve of mine, I know. Anyway, by chapter 7, in my notes, I say that Ajax is an avatar to put the reader so Carter can just explain how everything is going without actually doing anything. He even excuses this with the line, know the city and it'll open up to you. Know the city, know the victims, know the killer. This becomes a device for Carter to know everything. He assesses everything for how it looks and then tells you what's coming next. And I'm not talking about typical PI fashion. I'm talking about he looks at a garden and goes, okay, so the killer in this situation is this because of the way the walking path is. He literally gets to a house and looks at the garden and says, okay, so you see that garden over there? The killer is this. Because he just knows the city, knows the victims, knows the killers. So the second he sees anything, he knows everything. And again, this can lead to the misclassification error. So if he is wrong throughout the whole way and it's all just a mislead and he is just really, really bad, then also him being on the force and being this veteran and being seen as like this really, really great cop when he's wrong this whole time because he's misdirecting, like I can't see a situation in which this makes sense. But if anybody has read this book and can explain to me like how the rest of this goes, I might go back to finish it just to see how it goes. This is usually why I like to finish stories, to see the whole arc, to see how the different elements play out. I just couldn't force myself to finish this because of the way that it was written. But separating myself from that class by a couple of months, maybe I can get through it. My gosh. Ryan, I might be coming for you to see how the rest of the story ended up, just so I can know. And my notes say by chapter 8, yeah, Ajax is just the outsider asking questions about alliances that everyone in town knows. So Ajax is literally a receptacle for information. Yeah. One of my other notes is that this really sucks because the universe and the world building in this book is really interesting, and I'm really like, I wanted to know more about all of these different types of aliens and the different cities and the way that this stuff works, but I just couldn't stick with the story because of the characters. Oh, and this is also another one of my peeves, which is, well, I don't think it's a peeve, but it's a preference. And I think it's one of the reasons why I don't like mega huge sci-fi and mega huge fantasy. I don't like mega huge urban fantasy that does the same thing, where you introduce like a million different elements that don't necessarily connect. Like if you look at Supernatural, if you look at the Suki Steakhouse / True Bloods, if you just keep throwing in everything in the kitchen sink and having all of these different elements involved, then it feels like so much and there's not a lot of grounding to stand on for logic in that universe. And so when this had like these alien things and the sorcery and the mana and all of this other stuff, it became too much for me, which separates from the human element. And what I really enjoy in books is the human element, following the human element and following human stories. And so when it focuses so much more on world building or different world elements, I fall out of it, which is probably where my hottest take of I don't like fantasy books comes from. It's so much more of a focus on this immense world building over characterization. And I love characterization over world building. I know I am a terrible person. Not really, but not if I'm a terrible person, it's not for that reason, but that is where I separate from the writing community that all love fantasy. Nothing on you guys for loving fantasy, but it's just not my jam. Okay, so I've already talked about how Carter was a bad cop. I have to get into more information about how Carter was a bad cop just because I wrote like extensive notes on like everything he was doing that was wrong, and it was driving me insane. Okay, so how do I start this? Carter intimidated and coerced witnesses and suspects into cooperating, ignored Miranda rights, and lied about somebody being in custody in order to squeeze out a confession from them. And yes, these are all things that bad cops do, which is one of the reasons why I was so pissed off. Maybe not illegal in this world because this whole place is kind of, it sounds like it's a sketchy sketchlord town, but But all of these actions are unethical, and I wasn't bonded enough to care about Carter, and he didn't have any moral compass that made me interested in who he was. Then you've got him going to Jellica, showing pictures of the suspects, and then tainting her testimony and memory with leading questions, extra informations, like I said, the contamination error, and risky stuff like unconscious transference. Carter shows her a picture of Flanagan, and she's like, hey, I know that guy. And then she jumps from a couple of different places she might have seen him, and then Carter gives her all of this information on who Flanagan is, because obviously he hates Flanagan. This taints her eyewitness testimony and corrupts her memory, because now she might be placing that Flanagan face in all of these other places, along with the new information she has from Carter. It also creates a bias in the case for pressing charges in court, because he's giving her information other than what she should have and influencing her memory. By the time the charges are pressed, she may have forgotten where she knew Flanagan from originally, or where she got all of that information from about him. This creates a false confidence when you go on stand giving your witness statement. This is just such bad detective work in so many ways that Carter could not recover as a good cop or a hero. He also offers Jellica private, confidential case information that nobody should be having. And all of this bad cop stuff by the 50% mark ends with the precinct initially calling Carter crazy and having a revenge grudge on Flanagan, to them busting down the door, guns hot, and pressing charges with literally no evidence. And there were also like 3 different things going on, where you had the Squibb murder, you had the murder in the house, and then you had the Flanagan cult stuff, and none of it really felt connected. Maybe it all came together later in the ending, but all of these elements just felt very separated. I understand, and I like this vibe of, because it's a city that is overrun with crime and probably does not have enough cops like many of the cities that we live with in real life. The cops are constantly being spread too thin, going to a bunch of different locations, going to a bunch of different crimes at all times, and then having to deal with these different things. But they all just felt so random and so disconnected when you were dealing with, here is the political and the oil mogul, here is this random family and this butcher shop, here is this cult going on, and these candies involved. I don't know. Everything just felt very disconnected. And again, maybe they came together later, but between all of these elements, I just couldn't stick with it. So if you read this book, I would love to hear what your opinions are down in the comments below. I would love to hear how the book ends. Probably just put a spoiler in there in case there are people that haven't read it that would like to participate in comments. I don't know. But I would love to have a discussion with you on this. If the book sounds interesting to you, if you like buddy cop, if you like fantasy, check it out. If you like this cover, also check it out, because maybe it's your jam. It's got a lot of interesting stuff going on in it. And also, I would love to know if the bad cop part of Carter actually had the same effect on you as it had on me, because it was driving me freaking crazy. So with all of that said, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed what I do on this channel, please remember to like, share, and subscribe. And also, if you are looking for a new read, consider checking out my newly released book, Bleed More, Body More. It is available at all of your favorite retailers, and I hope you have a good time if you choose to read it. So thank you so much for watching. Have a great Monday, and don't die.
Was that Wayland Cross in the trunk? Do you know, or is that something that's still being figured out?
The person in the trunk was not Wayland Cross.
Is he in trouble?
We don't know who did it, but as the owner of the car, the longer he's missing, the worse it looks for him.
Cross isn't a killer. For the last couple of years, the average number of murders in Baltimore has been over 300, and it's been going up. Mind you, that's only whatever the badges count as official murder, and believe me, there are people that don't count when they die. Wayland? If you're down here, tell me. I'm not talking to the badges, I've been looking for you. They found a body in your trunk. Why? Did you do that? To the left. Plain black letters read along the wall. You walked in the corridor. Once that ends, you chose the dark is on the right. My vision goes blurry, flickers black and black and black for longer intervals until I can't see anything at all. I'm not screaming anymore. but my voice echoes back to me. Where the hell am I? You're dead, Josephine. Even smart people do stupid shit sometimes, right?